This study guide is for anyone preparing to take the USPA B license exam. It will cover all material as laid out in the Skydiver's Information Manual, or SIM, just in a little bit friendlier format. So let's begin with the BSRs that pertain to B licensed skydivers. Basic safety requirements, or BSRs, represent commonly accepted standards necessary to promote safety in average conditions. They can be found in Section 2 of the SIM, and USPA is able to grant waivers to some BSRs when an exception is needed. However, they typically can only be waived by the full board of directors, unless designated in the SIM by an S in brackets, which stands for SNTA, or an examiner can waive that particular BSR, or E stands for Executive Committee of the USPA Board. So what are some of the requirements that USPA lays out? Well, the first is complying with federal regulations. So not surprisingly, if you are in the United States, you may not make a skydive that violates FAA regulations. And one of the regulations that you've been adhering to ever since you were a student is that you must use the restraint system or seat belts in an aircraft anytime during taxi, takeoff, and landing. Well, USPA also requires a medical requirement, which is surprising to some people. This states that anybody engaging in skydiving must have a third-class medical certificate or a certificate of fitness from a physician, or what most of us are probably doing is agreeing with the USPA recommended medical statement that can be found in Section 4-3 of the SIM. Well, there's also an age requirement. Within the US, you must be at least 18 years of age to skydive. If you're jumping outside the US, then the minimum age requirement is set by the country that you're jumping in. There's also a membership requirement. So if you're jumping at a USPA group member drop zone and you are a skydiver that is cleared for self-supervision, meaning you can make a solo skydive, then USPA membership is required, unless you are a non-resident foreigner. So those traveling from another country to jump at a USPA group member DZ. Although nowadays, many DZs actually require that they obtain temporary USPA membership. What about alcohol and drugs? Well, you are not allowed to skydive if it appears that you are under the influence from either alcohol or drugs. And this is either legal or illegal drugs. So if you've taken a substance that interferes with your decision-making ability and or just makes you an unsafe skydiver in any way, you're staying on the ground. In addition, there is no skydiving allowed within 8 hours of consuming any alcoholic beverage. And the FAA actually also uses this rule with pilots. So pilots also follow the 8-hour bottle-to-throttle rule. For surface winds, they are unlimited for any licensed skydiver. But that doesn't mean that a DZ can't go about implementing their own rule for what they consider to be safe for certain licenses. For example, maybe it's a really windy day and you hear that a decision's been made that manifest is only open for C-licensed skydivers or higher. For opening altitude with a B license, you have a minimum altitude of 2,500 feet. There are DZ requirements as well. So for a B license, the landing area needs a minimum of 165 feet radial distance to the nearest obstacle. And obstacles include things like power lines, buildings, bodies of water, highways, vehicles, and trees. They also need to have manned ground-to-air communication that is present during their skydiving operations. And there's a pre-jump requirement that you determine appropriate altitude and ground winds before any jump. So finally, we've got the extraordinary skydives. So if you are going to make a night jump, a water jump, or a demo jump, well, you should only do that once you've received advice from an SNTA, an examiner, or a regional director. With a B license, you are not allowed to do any pre-planned breakaway jumps. So these are the intentional cutaways. If you're thinking about wingsuiting, well, those are permitted once you have at least 200 jumps and a current license. And finally, free fall is not permitted within 500 feet of a student, and that includes tandems when they're under canopy, with an exception made for a videographer. You also cannot be in free fall within 500 feet if a licensed skydiver that's under canopy, unless you've planned it ahead of time and you have received prior approval from that jumper. And that concludes the BSRs that pertain to B licensed jumpers.